Hello, everybody. So today I am very excited to get to bring to you somebody who I've known now for about 6 years. We met actually when I was living in LA and working professionally as an actor. And he is somebody truly wonderful, and I think he will have a lot of beautiful ideas to share with us. So he is the author of the book, Raising LGBTQ Allies. He is a TEDx speaker on the topic of LGBTQ identity and bullying and growing up and helping to raise kids and develop in a healthy way. He just completed his degree program in clinical psychology, focusing on LGBTQ mental health, and he is also a spiritual life coach. So Chris, welcome. It is such a pleasure to have you here today.
Yes, thank you for having me, Kay. It's good to be here.
So let's just start off by talking about your book, which is going to be coming out in Spanish next year. So congratulations. That's very fun and quite the honor to have your book being translated.
Yeah.
But would you tell us a little bit about where did the impetus for this book come from? How did it come to existence? And then for those of us who may not have children, how can this still be a benefit to us as we continue to work and heal from our own struggles growing up queer, for healing our own inner children?
Yeah. So I feel like those are like three kind of things that I could address. But yeah, thank you. The impetus of the book was a question that my nephew asked me. But I feel like, so just to kind of give some context, so the book is called Raising LGBTQ Allies, A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. And so messages from the playground is a metaphor that I use myself personally when I came out of the closet to understand the messages that I heard about being gay. And I grew up kind of I have a religious background. And so that's kind of part of my story. And so reconciling the messages that I heard, I used to refer to the messages from the playground that no matter who we are or where we come from, we all play on the same playground. So there's certain kind of messages that we pick up. So even me as a gay man, once I came out of the closet, I moved to Los Angeles to work for a large LGBTQ advocacy organization. But there was still something, I was about 20, like in my late 20s, so like maybe 28 or so. And I had been out living my life. I moved to Los Angeles. I was really excited about being here, but there was still something that wasn't quite like right. And so I started to reconcile my own, kind of doing my own work of like, oh, like even though I'm a gay man, I played on the same playground as everyone else. So I internalized a lot of the messages that were kind of external around me, whether it was from family, culture, society, religious groups. I didn't realize that those messages had kind of seeped inside. So that was my own journey of kind of understanding myself. So that said, that was a piece. So then when my nephew, fast forward 2015, I was home in Arizona visiting, because that's where I'm from. And I was there ironically I didn't write about this in the book, but I was there to give a workshop at the Arizona Equality and Justice Conference, which is an LGBTQ, workshop. And after that workshop, my mom had all my family members over, and my nephew at that family function had asked if the woman who was sitting next to me in the living room at my mom's house, if she was my girlfriend. And so his question just really caught me off guard, because I just assumed that he knew that I was gay. I live in LA, but I go home to visit. I had never brought a boyfriend home. But I just kind of thought that maybe my sister would have talked to him. I just kind of thought that was a conversation they would have had. So then when I discovered that he didn't, when I started to ask my family, like, hey, have you talked to your kids about, me being gay? And most of the parents, kind of gave the same response, was like, oh, well, he's 6 years old. He's too young to understand. And it was kind of like, understand. And so then I realized like there are nuances, and underneath that, keeping him from knowing that I was gay, there was kind of a belief, kind of the messages from the playground that was informing the reasons that they weren't having those conversations. So that propelled me. So I came back to Los Angeles, and I remember being at my computer, just doing all this like research of, like gender, sexuality, when do kids, all of these things. And I was coming up with all this information. I was like, oh my gosh, this could be so helpful. I felt like I found this like antidote, this serum that could help, families. Because I thought like, well, in my family right now, there has to be, statistically speaking, LGBTQ kids. I have a large family, and so there has to be at least a kid who is LGBTQ, or they're going to have a friend at school or know someone at school. And so by us keeping these conversations kind of silent or hidden, it's telling them something. So that kind of was the impetus. I ended up writing a letter that I sent to my family, encouraging them to have conversations, because I realized, like, I have so many cousins who have kids, and my brother, my sister, and if they're not considering that as a possibility, then we're kind of perpetuating the closet experience for young people. Or we're teaching people who aren't, the kids who aren't LGBTQ, that their identities kind of are like secret, or there's a certain place to have them. So I wanted to help prevent that. So that was the letter, and then that turned into an article, that turned into a workshop and other articles, and eventually a TEDx talk, and then the book that came out in 2021. So it's kind of the whole.
How did going from the TEDx talk to the book, was that somebody approaching you and saying, hey, can you write this down, turn it into something? Was that something you spearheaded? How did that come about?
Yeah, no, that was something that I very much spearheaded. I felt like I said, I found this serum or this antidote that I wanted to just share with more families, because after the TEDx talk, I was giving that same presentation or talk in other places around Los Angeles County. And so I felt like if I could have it in kind of a concise form, then that could help people who don't necessarily just live here in Los Angeles County, but that I could get it out and share it. Yeah.
I love that. So you must have a lot of opinions with what's been going on in Florida with the Don't Say Gay legislation going on, because in many ways, that whole argument of we shouldn't talk to children at a young age about these things is entirely antithetical to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it really is. And what's interesting though is that what's going on in Florida, similar laws have existed around the United States for some time. I mentioned I'm from Arizona, and Arizona up until I think 2020 or 2021, there was what was called no homo promo law. And that's kind of the nickname, like the nickname that you're hearing a lot about Florida is the Don't Say Gay. That's kind of the name that people are using. Similarly, there are laws that have been in place in other states across the country that have nicknames that are called no homo promo laws, which basically is similarly, in the sense similar to that law, is where teachers aren't able to talk about homosexuality in a positive light. So basically, if a high school student was taking, I'll speak to Arizona, if a high school student where I was born and raised was taking sex education, a teacher could not include homosexuality or even conversations around HIV and AIDS or sexual health and include homosexuality in that conversation. And so it was dubbed it was called the no homo promo law. And so it wasn't until 2020 or 2021 that law was, Arizona has a new superintendent that countered that law to see that it would be overturned. That was just a few years ago. And so what I write about in my book, and I actually include that in my book about the no homo promo laws, because there are other states that law is still on the books. And it speaks to these kind of societal beliefs that we have. And that's really what my hope is for the book, is that we address really what it means when we think about having conversations with kids about gender and sexuality. And yes, it is completely what's going on. And what's interesting is that before the pandemic, I feel like the pandemic really kind of ushered conversations that weren't having as much openly, kind of just catapulted them into the ethers. And so now we're kind of reconciling, we're having kind of this reconciliation with a lot of these things. They're more open, they're more out publicly. They've been there though for a long time.
Yeah. I think one of the frustrations, and this is something I often talk about, one of the frustrations is we all know from a very young age that we're different. Even if we can't name how or why or what is different about us, we queer kids no, I'm not like Billy and Susie and Tom, Dick, and Harry. There's something different about me, and different is dangerous. Different means I can be thrown out of the pack, I can be uh, removed from the group, and then to be alone is dangerous. Evolutionarily, to be thrown out of your pack is a death sentence, and that's been bred into our DNA. And so the frustrations of when we are 5, 6 years old, starting to realize something is different. Maybe I'm not like the other boys. Maybe I'm not like the other girls. And being able to have those conversations and see, well, are there other people having narratives similar to mine? Are there people having similar feelings to me? And how much more benefit there is to be able to hear positive narratives about other queer folk, other people in the LGBTQ community, and to realize that we aren't alone, to realize that we aren't that different, and how detrimental it is when authority figures, adults, are not given permission to say, like, hey, no, actually you're beautiful and wonderful, and there's a lot of people like you. um, how hard that must be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, those are really, really good points. And I think that, one of the things that I also hope to help people understand is that when we talk about, you and I are adults, and a lot of people who
Some
are,
days.
yeah, some days, a lot of people are, who have opinions about this are adults. And what I really write about in my book is that, when we talk about gender or sexuality or LGBTQ, even, talking to kids and including that in classroom or even family conversations, we're putting our adult constructs of
Yeah.
gender and sexuality onto children. But to your point, I was 6 years old when I knew that I was gay. At that time, I didn't know the word gay, or I didn't necessarily know what that meant. But like you
Mm-hmm.
said, one of the things I also think is important, and this is what I hope to help in my book, is that chapter 2 of my book talks very much about words and the importance of words that we use. And I've been teaching social emotional learning throughout Los Angeles County and working with young people. And one of the things I was really intentional about whenever I share my coming out story to classrooms is, kids, when they're in grade school or junior high, like to your point, they want to be a part of the pack, they want to be a part of the group. And using words like different is, a young person, they just want to belong. And so for me, it's really important to be able to help adults and people when they're talking about their difference, is to be able to include words, instead of saying, there's something different about me, because that still kind of puts the onus on like me, like that I'm the one
Mm-hmm.
other. And so
Mm-hmm.
using words like difference and talking about my identity especially in front of young people, helps me to think about the young person in the room who also has a difference, who maybe doesn't hear the word different and feel shame, or like people are going to make fun of them. So then they keep their identity hidden even longer, which contributes to the closet, which is a hotbed for shame and all of the other things that, oftentimes we have to unpack when we're adults. And so whenever I share my coming out story, especially when it's for young people, I'm really mindful of using the word difference. Like there was a difference about me. And I also invite parents and caregivers, because there are differences among the human race, and it's really important because differences matter, differences are important. But when we use words like different, it's kind of like separate, like other. And it kind of puts the onus on the person to make up for their being separate.
Totally. No, I can think back. I love that you mentioned 6 years old, like, because I can think back to that age too. And I have a memory of asking like the boy in my class who was known as being a really good drawer if he would draw for me the genie version of Jafar from Aladdin, because Genie Jafar is like super buff and ripped. And like knowing that like I found that like hypermasculine form really alluring and captivating and titillating. Um, but I never had anyone tell me that that was okay. And around that same time, even though I didn't have anybody who was like openly gay bashing, there definitely was that sentiment of same-sex attraction is less good. It's much less preferable.
Yeah.
Those are lower class, lower situation people. Um, and I started to hide that knowledge from myself. I buried it and then became very confused in my teenage years because I was disconnected from my identity. I became disconnected from my sexuality and had to go through a very long process of healing and reconciling that took through my mid to late 20s. Whereas had I been in an environment that was open and affirming and say, oh, that's great. You find Jeannie Jafar attractive. Wonderful. So that's awesome. That's this way of being. Here's other people who are like that. You've got a tribe. Own it. Like, how different would my adolescence and young adult years been had I been in an environment that had been inclusive?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. It's so important. And I think that in order for us to create inclusive environments and to be able to affirm identities, my book is very much, I often talk about, yes, the title is called Raising LGBTQ Allies. It's very much a book about preventing homophobia, transphobia, and bullying. It's also very much a spiritual book because it's important that we as adults do the work ourselves to unlearn and unpack the things, because just, cross out LGBTQ and insert anything else, and we're just
Yeah.
families that are perpetuating. My TEDx talk is called, the name of it is called What Children Learn from the Things We Don't Say.
Yeah.
That could be about anything. It's because
Yeah.
children are so intuitive. I was just talking last night to my niece. I FaceTimed with her, and she's 9 years old. And I haven't seen her, I think the last time I FaceTimed with her was last week or something, but I've had a haircut in between the times that we FaceTime. And the moment I turned on the video, she immediately like, oh, you got a haircut. Mind you, I've had many conversations with other people who have not noticed that I've had a haircut. And not only that, but I told her that I would call to surprise her because I knew that she was coming over to my mom's. And
Mm-hmm.
she's like, I knew you did because you were only talking to Nana. She calls my mom Nana. You were only talking to Nana for a minute. So she had looked at the time on the phone and knew that I was only talking to my mom. Had I been on the phone maybe for 10 minutes, is what she's saying, she wouldn't have necessarily believed that I called just to talk to her. But I thought that those two things were so insightful and are an
Yeah.
example of how kids are just like picking up everything that's around them. And so
Yeah.
as adults, it's oftentimes the things that I'm uncomfortable with or I don't know that maybe I avoid talking about or I avoid
Yeah.
having those conversations. The thing of it is, though, is that they're still learning. They're still
Yeah.
learning what it is that we're not talking about.
Yeah. It's one of the things I actually learned in my theater training when I was in college and when we were working on theater for youth is they taught us that you have to be even more emotionally grounded and more emotionally truthful when working with children audiences because their emotional sensitivity and their intuitive abilities to register what's really going on is more heightened
Yeah.
than adults, especially because as a young person you may not have the language skills to express yourself, and but what's going on in the room. And especially growing up being queer, I don't have any memories of my parents vocally being anti-gay, but
Right.
I sure as hell knew those feelings were there. And especially my father, who came out as bisexual 2 or 3 Christmases ago to me. He had a lot of tension around that, the part of himself that he didn't want to own. And that was felt in the room as a young person.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's such a good point. Because my book also is very much for me as a gay uncle, as someone, here I was living out and working for a national LGBTQ advocacy organization. I was in Arizona to give a workshop about self-care when it came to LGBTQ advocacy work. And yet there was still something, this book was very much, it helped propel me down an even further path of uncovering my own blind spots. What does it mean, to be a gay uncle? And how am I contributing to some of the messages from the playground? My book is very much an invitation for members of the LGBTQ community, if they're parents, if they're uncles, if they're aunts, if there are kids in their life, it's so important that we do our own work ourselves to unpack the shame, the trauma about our identities, because it's really easy to, fit into heteronormativity, or it's really easy to fit into kind of these societal dominant constructs. And then what we do is we're just perpetuating the messages that the children are picking up about certain identities.
Totally. And just to tie this to, for those of us who aren't in those environments, I think these are still really important things for us to reconcile with and to learn and pay attention to, because as we go on our own healing journeys and healing our own childhood wounds that still live within us, to look back with compassion, to look back with a more educated vantage, to say, here's why I experienced what I experienced. Here's how, were I an adult in these situations, I would have wished they could have been handled better. And to apply that to us in our current state as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What I hear with that is, passing on our resilience versus passing on our trauma. And
Amen.
whether or not we're LGBTQ or not, we all have trauma. We've all experienced, living on this planet as a human. It's really not, we cannot not experience fractures, whether it's, our identities, or, a soul fracture, a disconnection from ourselves. And so it's healing that trauma so that we don't pass that trauma on. And specifically as it relates to LGBTQ, members of the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of trauma as it relates to our identities, our sexualities, our gender. And so healing those so that we pass on our resilience to the younger generation is so very important.
And also healing it for how we treat one another.
Absolutely.
Too. One of the things that I think we've all witnessed in LGBTQ life is that queer people and gay people can be really unkind to one another and to themselves. And a large part of that comes from not having done the work of healing, not coming and approaching yourself with compassion, and not giving yourself that grace to heal and grow and evolve, and then taking it out on others. So how critical that work is just interpersonally within the community.
100%, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that I learned at my program that I was in for, clinical psychology is that, and I did the specialization in LGBTQ affirmative psychology. And so one of the biggest things that we as students, as clinicians, future clinicians, is to unpack our own internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, internalized queerphobia, because that's just such a part living in a heteronormative world. By virtue of being socialized in a dominant culture, we're going to have those. And oftentimes when I bring this up with clients, or when I talk about this with clients, it can be it's almost like the blame is being like, wait, if I'm talking about internalized there's a lot of defensiveness. There can be a lot of defensiveness around it, because it feels like, well, no, I'm not, I don't want to feel negatively about myself, and I don't want you to tell me that I'm feeling negatively about myself. I think it's important that we put the onus on the culture, the onus on the only reason that internalized fill in the blank exists is because external homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, exists. And so it's being able to talk about these, and have these conversations openly, because if not, we're going to continue to project our unhealed parts of ourselves. It's like the oppressed often become the oppressors. And so we have a community of people who, maybe if we're not familiar with our blind spots, it's going to come out in the way that we relate to one another.
And to recognize too how nuanced and layered and deep those things go. My husband and I were having a conversation just this past week, and side note, my husband actually went to the exact same degree program as Chris and did the same training. And one of the things he illuminated to me is, he's like, I'm really hearing right now that you're doing a lot of slut shaming of yourself. And for me, that is the internalized homophobia, growing up and saying, well, gay people are promiscuous, gay people are whores, they do all these behaviors that are so nasty, and I'm not like that. I'm a good gay. But there's a lot of internalized fear of queerness, a lot of internalized fear of gayness that comes along with that. And even though I've done a lot of work on these topics over the years, there's still more to be done. There's always more to be done.
Yeah, there is. And I think that that's really like, I just want to honor that you say that, because I think that's so important. Because I think that sometimes there's this sort of like, you're not a good gay, or you're not a good, member of the community, or I don't want to say that because that means that somehow maybe I'm doing it wrong. And I think that, it's these core wounds that we have, and being able to recognize that it's this kind of constant journey of being able to reconcile that. From the where I stand, it's not that it necessarily ever goes away. It's that we can like have more grace for ourselves to recognize that, this is part of my path of healing. This is part of my healing path. I come from a family of addiction, and so I go to a 12-step meeting specifically about growing up in a family with substance use, and the effects that had on me as a child, and having to be hyper vigilant about my surroundings, and to be super aware just so that I can take the temperature of a room to know what was going on, and those things I internalized. And so as an adult, I'm still processing, I'm still unlearning, I'm still reconciling and healing. And it's not that I'm bad or wrong or didn't do it right. It's that it's a process. And I think that, living in a dominant culture, it's very important when we're bombarded with messages of what masculinity is, what femininity is. I mean, we live in a binary world. And I think that there are a lot of things that are happening with the collective consciousness that are helping to chip that away. I think it's being able to reconcile that we have to have that level of awareness for our own blind spots, because things like heteronormativity, I say, is like, it's like humidity. You can't necessarily like see it, but you can feel it. It's thick, and we have to kind of, it's like, splinter. I come from Arizona, I mentioned before, but there are some cactuses that the needles are really small and like fuzzy, and they look almost soft, but if you touch them, they still hurt, and there are thousands of them in your hand. And so it's kind of like plucking out those thousands of soft little, needles.
Yeah, totally. So to pivot just a little bit, one of the things I like to ask people that I bring onto this channel is about their own experience of the intersection of spirituality and gayness.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I view my queerness as being a tremendous gift, as being a doorway into the other, a doorway, and the other being a different vantage of life, the other being the divine, but really seeing it as a tremendous blessing, and seeing special abilities that come in the spiritual realm from being a gender or sexually not normative person. So for you, where are you with that? How do those things intersect for you?
Yeah, that's a really good,
Excuse me.
it's a really juicy question. I feel like spirituality for me is very much a part of my queerness. Being gay, I feel like the last chapter of my book is called Uncle Chris, The Journey of a Soul. And I really write about the soul, and that I believe that, LGBTQ people on a soul level have come in to this planet to help teach others. Because when I first learned about spirituality, I've been on the spirituality, journey for some time. And I remember, living in Los Angeles, there are a lot of spiritual teachers, a lot of you used to live here. And so I used to go to the lectures and, the retreats. And what was really interesting is that, what was spirituality to me? And I remember going to a lecture one time, and the teacher talked about spirituality as being the direct experience of our own essence. And so for me, I kind of latched on to that as like, okay, if that's true, if spirituality is the direct experience of my own essence, and my own essence has to do with part of my identity as a queer man, that's a beautiful gift that I get to. The more I'm coming into contact with that, and the more that I'm able to share that, the more that I'm expressing my spirituality, the more I'm expressing my soul. And I think that the two are very absolutely connected. And I think that especially when it comes to specifically LGBTQ youth, being able to really teach parents about love, about acceptance, about empathy, on a soul level, if we want to kind of get into like the other realm, like metaphysical, like kind of conversations, like, from a soul perspective, you know, we heal the lessons that we have to learn are directly connected to what we have to heal. And so if I'm going to teach acceptance, if I'm going to teach empathy, what do I need to do to be able to do that? Accept myself, have more empathy toward myself. And by doing that, I'm teaching that to others.
Amen. It's something I always say is that the journey to know God is the journey to know yourself. And that when you turn that journey inwards to really, truly connect and know and love and be with the fullest expression of you, you will know God.
Right.
And this idea of the macro level and the micro level being reflections of one another, I find it really troubling, especially in the Christian tradition as we experience it here in America, that there's this conflicting idea that everyone is made in God's image, but some of the ways people are made are broken or unholy or sinful or detestable. And it's like, well, if you say everybody's made in the image of God, well, first off, that means God has a penis, or a vagina, so they're sexual and apparently enjoy sexual pleasure because we inherited that. And we see same-sex attraction and gender not normative behavior in all of the animal kingdom and throughout the human species, which means that then God must also be queer. Oh, no. God's not that. That's something wrong with you. That's the devil's work. Mm-hmm. No, it's not. It means we are divinely made. We are a reflection of the Almighty. We are an incarnation of divine consciousness. And we are perfect and we are whole and we are radiant. And when society can honor and celebrate those gifts, we'll have made a huge leap forward in our collective evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you speak to really important points because, one of the things that, I kind of the journey that I take readers on in my book is the third chapter is about, even if we didn't grow up with religion, you mentioned the United States, like in this country, this country was founded on Puritan values and that are still very much prevalent in a lot of the laws that exist in the States. And just to kind of give you an anecdotal example is I mentioned I just finished my program and there's something called law and ethics that, we had law and ethics exam that we have to take and law and ethics class. And in that class, we learn about mandatory reporting because as a therapist, you're a mandated reporter. And so in the state of California, anything that is outside of penile and vaginal intercourse is a mandated report. So for example, what that would look like is that if I'm a therapist, I get my license and I'm practicing as an LGBTQ affirmative therapist, and I have a 16-year-old gay male youth who I'm working with. And he comes to me to session and says that he went to prom with his boyfriend and they hooked up. They had oral sex or they had anal sex. Because that's outside of vaginal and anal intercourse, because he's 16, that would be a mandated report. If I had a client that was 16, same scenario, 16-year-old straight male, and he came to session and said that he went to prom with his girlfriend and they had sex, whether it was vaginal or oral. Well, if it was oral, it would still be a mandated report. But if it was vaginal, it would not be a mandated report.
Mm.
And so I share that because that really speaks to kind of going back to those no homo promo laws or don't say gay, is that speaks to these kind of dominant religious values that are infiltrated kind of in the laws that exist. And we're just a byproduct of our surroundings, and those things are carried in our consciousness. And it speaks to kind of going full circle back to what I mentioned about messages from the playground, is that we've absorbed these things unconsciously. And so being able to unpack what it means to be fill in the blank is such an important part of unlearning the things that have to do with misinterpreted, religious doctrine or anti-LGBTQ theology, especially as it relates to, considering what like for kids, having conversations with them.
Totally. Tell me a little bit more about your journey to decide to become a therapist, to go to this graduate program, because you had been doing coaching work, also building yourself as a spiritual life coach for some time before you entered this program.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if that's something you'll continue, because I do know therapists who also identify as coaches at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But do you want to tell me a little bit about where you were, how you came to this spot in your personal evolution?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it really does have to do with calling. And I feel like, a calling to be a therapist. When I set out to write the book, I had started a program because I knew that writing a book about a subject that I was inviting parents and caregivers to have really challenging conversations, nuanced conversations. I really needed to be able to hold space. And so I did a lot of research because I wanted to be able to hold space when it came to families that maybe didn't agree with me or didn't agree with what it was that I was offering. And so I found this program in Seattle at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and it was called the Allender Center. And the Allender Center does narrative-focused trauma training. And the whole premise of the Allender Center is that we can only take others as far as we've gone ourselves. And they do what's called story work, where we have to reconcile our own stories in order to be able to help take others along their story. And so I did that training as I was writing my book. And then I sort of kind of wrote myself into graduate school, is what I say, is that the further I went along in my own story and the further along I was hearing other people's stories, I felt like I could only take them so far with the work that I was doing. And so if I wanted to take them further, I would have to go further. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the work that I felt like I was being called to do was more of the depth work, was more of the healing work. And so that's kind of what led me to applying to graduate school, and is where I'm at today.
So it was a desire for personal growth.
It was a desire for personal growth, and I think a calling with my, my higher power. Right. I believe that, it was definitely something that was divinely inspired.
Yeah, I love that idea that we can help people to the extent that we have helped ourselves, that the areas we have explored, we can guide other people through. But if you've never been there before, it'd be like, oh, all right, well, let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
My husband tells a story that when he started this program that you just went through, one of his professors turned to the classroom and said, how many of you are in happy relationships right now? And people put their hands up. And he looked around and said, by the time you're finished with this degree program, most of you will no longer be in those relationships. Yeah. Not that those people were bad or wrong for you, but you are going to grow so much over the next 2 years that you're just going to evolve past them in a way, that you're going to require different things, that it is such a transformative experience and such a growth-filled experience. So I don't know if someone said that to you when you were there, or if that was your experience, but that's something that has stuck with me. Yeah, I didn't hear that specific example. I do know though that they said, not just with relationships, but they talked a lot about, the relationships that you have, not with like intimate relationships, but just your life and like the things that you're doing right now. Because it is such an exploratory, and I'm not in a relationship with someone. And so all of that was kind of, the work was with myself.
which was, I mean, it really did break me down in a lot of ways, and helped me to see things, you know, kind of in a whole entirely new way.
So, if somebody wants to embark on a spiritual journey of self-exploration, of personal growth, of owning their divinity, seeing their wholeness, how do you recommend somebody begins? What should they do? Should they find a mentor, a coach, a therapist, a guide? Should they read books? Should they meditate? Like, what are first steps?
Yeah, gosh, first steps. That's such a good question. I think it's, you know, everyone has their own kind of experience and journey, and I don't think it's a one size fits all necessarily. I think that listen to the call, because, you know, the call does go out to everyone and it may look a certain way for you. And so, you know, for me, it was books started kind of presenting themselves. Then I would read the book, and that led to somewhere else, to led to somewhere else. It was kind of like the discovering breadcrumbs through the forest. So that's what helped me, was books. The books turned to lectures. The lectures turned to meditation. The meditation turned to teachers. I did also have my own personal spiritual life coach, and that was part of my own journey. Because you know, when I had questions around, like, I remember I was working with this person for a little while, and I showed up for a session. This was like way pre-pandemic, and I showed up to do our session in person, and I had started to see numbers. Like, I was seeing a lot of like 555, 444, 1111, and, you know, like to the point where it was, okay, what's happening? And I remember I showed up and I asked, you know, hey, yeah, I just want to, you know, I'm starting to see numbers. And she kind of just said it so matter of factly, oh, honey, that's because you're opening up. And so just kind of being able to kind of have someone that I can share some of my experiences with was really helpful, and to help kind of guide me and help me understand what it was that my process was going through, that what my process was and what I was going through.
I love that. Something I frequently say to people is, my job as a guide is not to get you to work with me, but to provide maybe a piece that you need on your journey. And if that sometimes means introducing you to other people who might really resonate with you, I'm more happy to do so. So in that spirit, if with me introducing you to people watching this video, if somebody really resonates with you and loves what you have to say and loves your approach and the space you hold, how can they work with you more deeply? I'm assuming they have to be based in California to be a patient of yours, but do you coach with people outside of California, or what's the story?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah, as a therapist, they do have to be in California, in the state of California. As a coach, they could be international. So I work with clients, coaching clients, and the work I do with coaching is different. And I'm very, you know, I explain that. And so depending on what the person's looking for in their process, some of it could be therapeutic, some of it could be coaching. But if they're in California, therapy. If not, then, you know, coaching, depending on what their needs are.
Cool. And what would you say is kind of what excites you to work on, or your focus, or why would somebody be a good fit for you?
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. I'm just really passionate about, you know, helping the LGBTQ community heal the inner scripts, I call them, the messages from the playground that we've internalized, that maybe we're not aware of, that are impacting our lives and our relationships. And so I'm passionate about helping people to heal those, whether it's the person or even family members. So I work with parents as well, and helping them to unpack them themselves so they can show up more fully for their children and for their, you know, loved ones.
Great.
Yeah.
Love that. And then how do people find you? Website, social media, where do you prefer them to look for you?
Yeah, my website and social media is the same. So Road Trip to Love, all one word, is my website. And then social media, Facebook, Instagram is also a Road Trip to Love.
I love that. Yeah. Me and Chris actually met when I was in LA, and I was running a blog at that time called On the Road to Bliss. And I was like, we have titled our branding very similarly.
Yeah.
I want to know more about you.
Yeah.
So I love it.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah,
Please
thank
check out his book, Raising LGBTQ Allies. Lots of wonderful insights. Give it to a friend, family member who you know is on their own parenting journey or working with youth. Thank you so much for your time. It is such a pleasure to get to connect.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's been good to see you.